The morning mist clung to the towering pines around Dead Horse Creek like ghostly fingers, and Chief Red Hawk knew immediately that something was wrong. In 45 years of hunting these forests, he had never witnessed such behavior from a gray wolf, motionless, alert, protective, rather than predatory. The massive female sat perfectly still between the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, her amber eyes fixed on something hidden beneath her powerful frame. Red Hawk raised his weathered hand, signaling his hunting party to halt. Behind him, Standing Bear's calloused fingers tightened around his bow, while Two Hawks and Running Wolf spread out in the practiced formation they had perfected through countless raids. The failed buffalo hunt had left them all on edge. Another day of empty snares meant another night of hollow-eyed children staring at cooking pots that held nothing but water and hope. The wolf's pointed ears twitched at the sound of distant howling echoing through the forest canopy. Another pack, perhaps territorial rivals, was moving through the wilderness somewhere beyond the rushing creek. Red Hawk felt ice crystallize in his stomach as he recognized the hunting call's wolves competing for territory were viciously aggressive, viewing any intruders as threats to be eliminated with fang and claw. "Chief," whispered Standing Bear, his voice barely audible above the wind, rustling through countless pine needles. "We should move. Those howls are getting closer, and they sound hungry." Red Hawk limped forward, his left leg throbbing with each careful step. The old bullet wound from the Crow Creek battle 3 months ago had never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent reminder of the settlers' expanding aggression. The lead ball was still lodged deep in his kneecap, a constant companion that flared with white-hot pain during long hunts like this one. As he approached within 20 feet of the wolf, Red Hawk finally saw what held the animal's complete attention. 2 newborn babies, impossibly small and fragile, were nestled against the wolf's warm belly. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm, and their pale pink skin marked them unmistakably as white children. The wolf's massive head lowered protectively over them, and her tongue gently cleaned their delicate faces with maternal tenderness. The sight struck Red Hawk like a physical blow to his chest. The boy's eyes, when they briefly fluttered open, were the same piercing blue as his own lost son, Little Eagle. The girl's delicate features reminded him painfully of his daughter, Bright Moon, who had died screaming in the flames of their burned teepee. His wife, Singing Bird, had perished trying to shield their children from the settlers' bullets, leaving Red Hawk with grief that cut deeper than any physical wound. This is complete madness. Running Wolf hissed, moving closer to his older brother. "We have no business with white children. Our people are starving, and you want to risk our lives for the offspring of our enemies." Red Hawk studied the wolf's behavior with the practiced eye of a lifetime hunter. The animal was clearly a female, her teats swollen with milk, though no pups were visible anywhere nearby. Her coat was matted with dried blood around her hindquarters, and there were healing puncture wounds on her powerful legs that suggested recent trauma from metal traps. Yet her entire focus remained on the human infants, grooming them with the same fierce tenderness she would show her own young. The babies appeared to be twins, perhaps a week old at most. Their clothing was simple frontier fabric, rough wool blankets, and cotton undergarments, but the quality was noticeably better than most settlers could afford. Someone had taken considerable care to wrap them warmly before. Before what? How had they come to be here alone, in the vast wilderness, thriving under a wild predator's protection? "Look at those blankets." Two Hawks observed quietly, his keen eyes noting details that escaped others. "That's not cheap trade goods. These children belong to someone with real means." Red Hawk nodded grimly, noting the careful stitching and the subtle patterns woven into the wool. But more importantly, he saw no signs of violence scattered around the scene. No blood staining the forest floor, no torn clothing, no scattered belongings suggesting panic or desperation. The babies had been placed here deliberately, not abandoned in the chaos of attack or flight. The distant howling grew noticeably louder, and the wolf's ears flattened against her broad skull. She rose slowly to her powerful haunches, never taking her intense gaze off the approaching sounds. and positioned herself more squarely between the babies and the perceived threat. Her hackles rose along her spine like a ridge of dark fur, and a low growl rumbled from deep in her throat. "She's actually protecting them," Standing Bear said with genuine wonder creeping into his voice. "A wild wolf is protecting human children like they were her own pups." Red Hawk's scarred hand moved instinctively to the sacred medicine pouch at his belt, where he kept a lock of his wife's silky hair and small stones from each of his children's first steps. The weight of those precious memories pressed against his ribs like a physical ache that never truly faded. The Lakota way demanded protection of the innocent, regardless of their origins. But these were white children. Harboring them could bring devastating retribution from the army or bounty hunters seeking easy targets. Yet, as he watched the wolf's gentle ministrations, Red Hawk felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant since his family's brutal death. The protective instinct that had driven him to become a war chief, the same primal force that had made him charge into hopeless battles to save his people, was awakening again like a sleeping bear roused from winter slumber. The competing wolves were definitely approaching now, their calls becoming more aggressive and coordinated. Red Hawk could hear them crashing through the thick underbrush, their voices carrying the unmistakable tone of predators who had caught an interesting scent. When they arrived, they would view the babies as either threats to be eliminated or curious prey to be investigated with deadly claws and razor teeth. "My brother," Running Wolf said urgently, his voice carrying the weight of practical concern, "we cannot save every lost child in this territory. Our own people need us to bring back meat, not more mouths to feed." Red Hawk understood his younger brother's concerns with perfect clarity. But something about this scene defied simple abandonment. The wolf's protective stance, the peaceful expressions on the babies' faces, the complete absence of violence, it all suggested a story far more complex than simple abandonment by panicked parents. The howling grew closer, and the wolf's response was to lower her massive head even closer to the babies, as if shielding them from invisible threats with her own body. Her amber eyes met Red Hawk's across the small clearing, and he saw intelligence there that seemed almost human in its depth and understanding. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind them, and the wolf's head snapped toward the sound with predatory alertness. The rival pack was close now, perhaps only minutes away from discovering this strange scene. Red Hawk's decision in the next few seconds would determine whether these mysterious children lived or died in the most brutal way imaginable. But before he could formulate a plan, the sharp crack of a rifle split the morning air like thunder. 3 men exploded from the thick underbrush, with the subtlety of charging buffalo, their weapons trained on the wolf and the hunting party with professional precision. The leader was a massive man with a tangled black beard and eyes like chips of winter ice. His leather coat was stained with old blood and newer mud, and the rifle in his powerful hands was aimed directly at the wolf's head with unwavering steadiness. "Well, well," the bearded man drawled his voice, carrying the harsh accent of the Eastern Territories. "Looks like we got ourselves a whole little gathering here. Morning, boys. Name's Vernon Pike, and I do believe you found something that rightfully belongs to me." Red Hawk recognized the type immediately, a bounty hunter, but something far worse than the usual breed. Pike's clothes were too fine for a simple trapper, too worn for a legitimate lawman. This was a man who lived by violence and intimidation, who took what he wanted and eliminated obstacles with the casual brutality of a natural predator. "You can move along now." Pike continued his rifle, never wavering from the wolf's position. "This here's a private family matter, and I don't much need any red-skinned witnesses to complicate things." The wolf, sensing the immediate and deadly threat, rose slowly to her full height without stepping away from the babies. Her hackles rose along her spine like a dark ridge, and her growl deepened to a sound that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but her protective instincts were clearly stronger than any survival instinct. Private matter. Red Hawk stepped forward, ignoring Running Wolf's restraining hand on his muscled arm. These are children. Helpless babies who need protection, not violence from armed men. Pike's cold gaze flicked to Red Hawk, taking in the traditional war paint and ancient weapons with obvious disdain. Indian, you'd best keep your red nose out of white folks' business. These young ones are coming with me, and that's the absolute end of this discussion. For what purpose do you want infants? Red Hawk's English was careful but clear, learned during his forced years at the mission school before he had escaped back to his people and traditional ways. Pike's smile was all yellowed teeth and no warmth whatsoever. Could be they're worth good money to the right people. Could be they're just evidence that needs proper disposing of. Could be I just don't like the idea of wild animals raising human children. Don't much matter to you, does it? The casual mention of murdering babies sent a chill through Red Hawk's spine like ice water. Behind Pike, two younger men had spread out in a practiced flanking maneuver, their weapons trained on the hunting party, with the ease of experienced killers. Johnson, a thin man with nervous darting eyes, kept glancing at the wolf as if expecting it to attack at any moment. Martinez, broader and more confident, held his rifle with the practiced ease of someone who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Red Hawk's warriors shifted position almost imperceptibly, their hands moving to their weapons in response to the obvious threat. The babies had begun to stir at the sound of raised voices, their small faces scrunching in preparation for the tears that would surely come. The wolf's protective stance became even more pronounced, her powerful body completely blocking Pike's line of sight to the helpless infants. Now move that damn animal out of my way. Pike snapped to his men with growing impatience. Johnson, get around to the left side. Martinez, take the right flank. If that wolf doesn't back down real quick, we'll make a nice rug out of its hide. The babies began to cry, their voices thin and helpless in the morning air. The sound seemed to galvanize the wolf, which took a deliberate half-step forward, placing herself even more squarely between the hunters and the infants. Her amber eyes never left Pike's face, and Red Hawk could see the animal's powerful muscles tensing for a fight she couldn't possibly win. You would actually kill children? Red Hawk asked, though he already knew the answer from the man's cold demeanor. Men like Pike viewed human life as nothing more than a commodity to be bought, sold, or eliminated as convenience dictated. I'd kill anything that gets in my way, Pike replied matter-of-factly. Now you red-skinned sons of bitches can ride out of here peaceful-like, or you can join that wolf in hell. Makes absolutely no difference to me either way. The wolf's growl became a full snarl, and she took another deliberate step forward, her massive head lowered in a clear threat display. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger, and Red Hawk realized that the next few seconds would determine not just the fate of the babies, but the moral direction of his own life. I cannot leave children to die, he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Pike's harsh laugh was like grinding stone. Then you're about to join them in the afterlife, Chief. Red Hawk slowly placed his rifle on the ground, and the metal clicking against a small stone. The gesture was deliberate, calculated to appear non-threatening while actually positioning himself for the hand signals he was about to give his seasoned warriors. We want no fight with you, he said, raising his empty hands in apparent surrender. These children are innocent of whatever quarrel you have with their parents. It should not extend to helpless babies. Pike's men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected development. They had come prepared for resistance, not negotiation and surrender. Smart Indian, Pike said, though his rifle remained trained on the wolf with deadly precision. Johnson, Martinez, keep your weapons trained on these savages, while I deal with our furry problem here. Red Hawk's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, forming traditional Lakota battle signs that would be invisible to anyone not trained in their ancient meaning. Flank left. Flank right. Wait for my signal. Protect the babies above all else. Standing Bear's sharp eyes flicked to Red Hawk's hands, then back to Pike's men with new understanding. Two Hawks began sliding almost invisibly through the thick underbrush, his dark clothing blending perfectly with the forest shadows. Running Wolf remained motionless, but Red Hawk could see his brother's powerful muscles coiling like a spring under tremendous tension. The wolf seemed to sense the rising tension in the air around her. Her entire body was now rigid, with barely contained aggression, every muscle ready to explode into violent action. The baby's cries grew more insistent, and the animal's protective instincts were clearly reaching a dangerous breaking point. "Easy now," Pike murmured more to himself than to the wolf. "Just need to move you out of the way so I can collect what rightfully belongs to me." He took a careful step forward, and the wolf's snarl became something primal and terrifying. The animal's black lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were yellow-white and razor-sharp, designed by nature for tearing flesh from bone. Her stance lowered into a predatory crouch that promised explosive violence. Pike's finger began to tighten on the trigger. "Last chance, you mangy bitch." The rifle blast was deafening in the enclosed space of the forest. But Pike's shot went wide as the wolf launched herself at him with incredible speed and power. The bullet splintered bark from a pine tree 6 feet to the left as the massive animal slammed into Pike's chest, sending him crashing backward into his own men in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Red Hawk's signal was the wolf's heroic attack. "Protect the children," he shouted in Lakota, diving toward the babies as his warriors exploded into coordinated motion like a well-oiled machine. Standing Bear's arrow took Johnson in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his rifle flying into the thick underbrush. Two Hawks emerged from concealment behind Martinez like a vengeful spirit, the butt of his rifle connecting with the hunter's skull in a sickening crack that echoed through the forest. Running Wolf was already moving toward the fallen Pike, his deadly tomahawk gleaming in the filtered morning light. The wolf and Pike rolled together in the carpet of pine needles, the animal's powerful jaws snapping at the hunter's exposed throat, while Pike desperately tried to bring his razor-sharp knife into play. The man's screams of pain and terror mixed with the wolf's savage snarls, creating a sound that seemed to emerge from the very depths of hell itself. Red Hawk reached the babies just as Pike managed to kick the wolf off him with a vicious blow to her ribcage. The animal rolled away, bright blood streaming from a deep gash along her side, where Pike's knife had found its mark. But the distraction had been enough. Red Hawk scooped up both infants, their piercing cries filling the air as he pressed them protectively against his chest. "Fall back to the creek," he shouted to his warriors over the chaos. "Move quickly." Standing Bear loosed another arrow, this one taking the recovering Johnson in the leg and dropping him completely to the forest floor. Two Hawks grabbed Martinez's rifle before melting back into the underbrush like a ghost. Running Wolf's tomahawk whistled through the air, missing Pike's head by mere inches as the hunter rolled desperately away from the gleaming blade. The wolf, despite her serious wound, limped determinedly after Red Hawk as he crashed through the forest toward the sound of rushing water. Behind them, Pike's furious curses mixed with the agonized groans of his injured men, but Red Hawk could hear the big man struggling to his feet with murderous intent. "You red bastards." Pike's voice echoed through the trees, full of rage and deadly promise. "I'll skin every last one of you alive for this. Those babies belong to me, and I'll kill anyone who tries to take them." Red Hawk's wounded leg sent spikes of white-hot agony through his hip with each desperate step, but he forced himself to keep moving through sheer will. The babies were crying frantically now, their small bodies shaking with fear and cold. Behind him, he could hear Pike crashing through the underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth or strategy. The creek was just ahead, its waters running fast and cold with mountain runoff. Red Hawk's warriors were already there, taking defensive positions behind fallen logs and massive boulders. The wolf collapsed next to the rushing water, her labored breathing visible in the cool air. But her amber eyes remained alert and focused on the babies. "How bad is she hurt?" Running Wolf asked, indicating the wolf's bleeding wound. Red Hawk examined the gash along the animal's powerful ribs. It was deep and serious, but not immediately fatal, though infection would be a grave concern. She'll survive if we can keep her from losing too much blood and keep moving. Pike's voice grew noticeably closer, accompanied by the sounds of breaking branches and continuous cursing. You can't run forever, Chief. I know this territory better than any of you savages, and I've got all the time in the world to hunt you down. Red Hawk looked down at the babies cradled in his arms. They had stopped crying from pure exhaustion, but their small faces were pale and their breathing was shallow. They desperately needed warmth, food, and proper shelter, none of which he could provide while running through the wilderness with a killer on their trail. We need to keep moving, Standing Bear said urgently. He's right about knowing the territory, and with the babies making noise, we're easy to track. Red Hawk nodded grimly. The pursuit that was about to begin would test every skill they possessed, and he wasn't entirely certain they would all survive it. But one thing was absolutely certain. Vernon Pike would have to kill him before he would surrender these innocent children to a man who spoke so casually of murdering babies. The wolf struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, but determined to continue. Her amber eyes met Red Hawk's with an intensity that spoke of shared purpose and understanding. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as unlikely allies, bound by protective instinct. The chase began in earnest as the afternoon sun climbed higher, turning the dense forest into a maze of shifting shadows and deceptive sounds. Red Hawk's war party moved as quietly as possible through the thick underbrush, but the baby's intermittent crying made true stealth impossible. Every few minutes, one or both infants would begin to wail their voices, carrying through the trees like a beacon guiding their relentless pursuer. Pike's voice echoed from behind them, sometimes close enough that they could hear individual words, and threats sometimes fading into the distance, only to return with renewed intensity and fury. Come on out, Chief. You're only making this harder on yourself and those babies. I'll make it quick if you surrender now. Red Hawk's wounded leg was becoming a serious and growing liability. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through his hip, and he could feel the old bullet wound beginning to swell from the constant stress and movement. Standing Bear offered repeatedly to carry one of the babies, but Red Hawk stubbornly refused. He wouldn't burden his warriors with additional responsibility when they needed to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. The wolf followed at a careful distance, her limp becoming more pronounced as they traveled deeper into the wilderness. Bright blood continued to seep from the gash in her side, leaving a faint but visible trail that Pike would undoubtedly find and follow. Yet the determined animal refused to abandon them, always staying within protective sight of the babies she had claimed as her own. We should split up, Running Wolf suggested during a brief rest beside a small tributary stream. Some of us lead Pike away, while others take the babies to safety. Red Hawk shook his head firmly. We stay together. Pike has wounded men, not dead ones. They'll recover soon enough, and then we'll face them separately when we're weaker. Our strength lies in unity. Thunder rumbled ominously overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall through the thick canopy. The weather was turning, which could prove either salvation or complete disaster. Rain would wash away their scent trail and make tracking considerably more difficult. But it would also make the treacherous terrain even more dangerous and increase the risk of the babies becoming fatally cold. As they resumed their desperate flight, Red Hawk noticed something increasingly troubling about the wolf's erratic behavior. The animal would suddenly dart ahead, then circle back, then move off to one side as if following a scent trail they couldn't detect. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. But there was something else there too, a kind of desperate urgency that Red Hawk couldn't fully interpret. Chief. Two hawks called softly from his rear guard position. Pike's gained considerable ground. I can see him through the trees maybe 200 yards back and closing fast. Red Hawk risked a quick glance backward and caught sight of Pike's distinctive leather coat moving between the towering pine trunks. The man was alone, having apparently left his wounded companions behind. but he was moving with the steady, implacable determination of a natural predator who had locked onto his chosen prey. His rifle was held ready, and his cold eyes constantly scanned the forest for any sign of his quarry. The babies were growing increasingly restless, their small bodies shivering despite the layers of blankets Red Hawk had wrapped around them. He realized with growing alarm that they desperately needed shelter, warmth, and nourishment, none of which he could provide while running through the wilderness. The infants were perhaps only a week old, far too young to survive extended exposure to the harsh elements. As if reading his troubled thoughts, the wolf suddenly veered off the narrow game trail they had been following and headed toward a cluster of massive boulders that had tumbled down from the hillside above centuries ago. The animal's behavior was insistent, almost frantic, and Red Hawk made the crucial decision to trust her instincts and follow. Behind the weathered rocks, they discovered a small cave, barely large enough for the entire party, but dry and easily defensible. The opening was concealed by hanging vines and partially blocked by fallen stones, making it nearly invisible from the outside. "We make our stand here," Red Hawk announced, settling the babies on a thick bed of dry pine needles in the deepest part of the cave. "If Pike wants them, he'll have to come through all of us to get them." Standing Bear and Two Hawks took strategic positions at the cave mouth, their weapons ready, and arrows nocked. Running Wolf began gathering dry wood for a fire, though they all knew the smoke would certainly give away their position to their pursuer. The wolf collapsed just inside the entrance, her breathing shallow but steady, her amber eyes never leaving the babies. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the stone above their heads with increasing intensity. Red Hawk wrapped the babies more tightly in their blankets, trying to share his body heat with them while monitoring their condition. The boy had stopped crying and was watching him with those unsettling blue eyes, while the girl slept fitfully against his chest. "He's coming," Standing Bear whispered urgently. "I can see him moving up the slope." Red Hawk checked his rifle and mentally counted his remaining ammunition. They had perhaps 20 rounds between them, not nearly enough for a prolonged siege. Pike would likely try to wait them out, knowing that the babies couldn't survive indefinitely in the cave without proper food and warmth. The wolf suddenly raised her head, ears pricked forward with alert attention. She was listening to something beyond the range of human hearing. Then Red Hawk heard it too, a faint scratching sound like claws on stone coming from above. "He's above us," Two Hawks said quietly, climbing the rocks to get a better position. Pike's voice suddenly boomed from directly overhead, magnified and distorted by the stone formations. "Comfortable down there, Chief. Hope you got plenty of supplies, because we're going to be here for a nice long while." Red Hawk realized with growing dread that Pike had found the perfect siege position. The man could simply wait above them until the babies' cries from hunger and cold became unbearable. And when Red Hawk finally emerged to surrender, Pike would methodically kill them all to eliminate any possible witnesses to his crimes. The wolf's intense amber eyes met his across the cramped cave space, and Red Hawk saw his own grim determination reflected there. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as brothers in arms, bound by the sacred duty to protect the innocent. During the long, restless night in the cave, Red Hawk tried desperately to comfort the crying babies by checking their crude wrappings for any sources of discomfort. The boy was particularly fussy, his small body rigid with hunger and cold. As Red Hawk carefully adjusted the blankets, his weathered fingers found something unexpected tucked beneath the wool. Against the girl's chest, a piece of paper stained with dried blood and folded tightly. By the dim, flickering light of their carefully shielded fire, Red Hawk slowly unfolded what appeared to be a hastily written letter. The handwriting was distinctly feminine, shaky with either fear or weakness, and the words were written in English, using what appeared to be a mixture of ink and blood. "If anyone finds my precious children, please know their names are Samuel and Sarah. Their father was Thomas Clayton, brutally murdered by Vernon Pike for our legal land claim near Beaver Creek. Pike promised to protect us in exchange for my silence about Thomas's death. but I know he means to kill us all to cover his many crimes. I am too weak to run further, bleeding from where Pike shot me when I tried to stop him from taking my babies. The wolves have been watching our cabin for days since Thomas died. I think they sense the violence and death. If God wills it, perhaps they will be kinder to my children than the men who should have protected them. Pike plans to sell them to traffickers, or worse, to remove all evidence of his murders. He has done this before to other families. I found papers in his saddlebag listing the names: the Morrison family near Deadwood, the Chen family by Silver Creek, the Rodriguez family at Painted Rock, the Schmidt family near Devil's Canyon, the Johnson family at Willow Grove, and the Patterson family by Eagle's Nest. All dead, all their land claims stolen. If you find this letter, please know that my children are innocent of their father's blood. Seek justice for all of us. Elizabeth Clayton, written in my own blood, as Pike's men searched our cabin for valuables. Red Hawk's hands trembled violently as he read the letter a second time, then a third. The implications crashed over him like a massive river in flood season. These babies weren't random orphans. They were the children of murder victims, and Pike was a serial killer who had perfected a system of land theft through systematic murder. The wolf's strange protective behavior suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. Red Hawk looked at the animal lying near the cave entrance, her amber eyes watching him with that unsettling intelligence. This wasn't just any wolf. It was a female whose own pups had likely been killed by Pike's traps or guns, and whose maternal instincts had been triggered by the sound of crying babies. "What is it, brother?" Running Wolf asked, noticing his older brother's stricken expression. Red Hawk translated the letter's shocking contents into Lakota, his voice growing harder and more determined with each terrible word. As the truth unfolded, his warriors' faces grew grave with understanding. Pike wasn't just a brutal bounty hunter. He was a methodical serial killer who used violence to systematically claim territory from legitimate settlers across the entire region. 6 families. Standing Bear said quietly, his voice filled with horror. 6 entire families murdered for their land. Red Hawk studied the letter again, noting additional details he had missed in his first shocked reading. The handwriting was shaky, but not death-weak, and the woman had mentioned being shot, but not fatally wounded. Elizabeth Clayton had been seriously injured, but might have survived long enough to escape and hide. This changes everything. Two Hawk said grimly, "If Pike kills us, no one will ever know what happened to these people or the other families he's murdered. We're the only witnesses left." Red Hawk carefully refolded the letter and placed it in his sacred medicine pouch next to the precious mementos of his own family. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Just as his wife and children had been killed by settlers seeking to claim Lakota lands, Thomas Clayton and 6 other families had been murdered by a man systematically stealing homesteads through violence and deception. But there was something else in the letter that sent ice through Red Hawk's veins. Elizabeth Clayton had written about wolves watching their cabin for days after her husband's death. The female wolf, now protecting the babies, had been hunting near the Clayton homestead, probably following the scent of death and abandonment that predators instinctively recognize. The wolf seemed to sense his intense scrutiny. She struggled to her feet despite her injury and moved closer to the babies, her nose gently touching each small head in a gesture of fierce protection. The tenderness was so profound that Red Hawk felt his throat tighten with emotion. "We need to survive this," Red Hawk said with sudden burning intensity. "Not just for Samuel and Sarah, but for justice. Pike has murdered at least 7 families, and he'll continue killing until someone stops him permanently." Running Wolf nodded slowly. "But first, we have to get out of this cave alive. And those babies need food and warmth soon, or they'll die anyway." Pike's voice drifted down from above them, taunting and confident. "Getting cold down there, Chief. Those babies sound mighty hungry. How long before you have to choose between watching them starve slowly and watching them die quick?" Red Hawk looked at the babies sleeping fitfully against his chest. Samuel and Sarah Clayton orphaned by systematic greed and violence, protected by a wolf who had lost her own young to the same methodical killer who had murdered their father. The story was almost too cruel to believe, but the evidence was written in blood and wrapped around his heart like a sacred burden. The wolf's amber eyes met his again, and Red Hawk saw something there that transcended mere animal instinct. This creature understood loss, understood the need for justice, understood that some things were worth dying for. She wasn't just protecting random human babies, she was standing guard over the last remnants of a family destroyed by evil. This wolf, Red Hawk said slowly, his voice filled with growing understanding. She's been watching over this family for days. She witnessed Pike's crimes, and when he abandoned the babies to die, she claimed them as her own children. Two hawks leaned forward intently. You think she actually saw the murder? Red Hawk nodded grimly. Animals understand death and abandonment better than humans sometimes. She's been hunting near their cabin, probably drawn by the scent of blood and fear. When she found the babies alone and helpless, her maternal instincts overcame everything else. The storm outside was growing stronger, but Red Hawk no longer saw it as an obstacle. The weather was about to become their ally in ways Pike couldn't anticipate. And somewhere out there, if the letter was accurate, Elizabeth Clayton might still be alive, wounded, hiding, but potentially able to testify against her husband's murderer and bring justice for all 7 families. The wolf struggled to her feet and moved to the cave entrance, her nose testing the air with careful precision. Something had changed in the storm's pattern, and her behavior suggested she sensed opportunity rather than danger approaching through the darkness. Red Hawk made his decision with the certainty of a man who had found his true purpose. We move at first light. The storm will cover our escape, and Pike won't expect us to leave the shelter voluntarily. But even as he spoke, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Pike would never let them reach safety with the evidence of his systematic crimes, and the journey ahead would test every skill they possessed. The wolf's sacrifice had shown him something profound about the nature of protection and justice, and he was determined to honor that lesson with his life, if necessary. The babies slept on, unaware that their survival depended on a wounded Lakota war chief, a dying wolf, and a mother who might still be alive somewhere in the vast wilderness. But Red Hawk had faced impossible odds before, and he had never been more determined to win a battle that would determine the fate of justice itself. The storm that had been threatening all day finally unleashed its complete fury as dawn broke gray and violent over the Dakota territory. Lightning split the sky in jagged, brilliant branches, and thunder crashed through the forest with enough force to shake loose stones from the cave walls. The rain came down in torrential sheets, turning every stream into a raging torrent and every slope into a treacherous slide of mud and loose rock. Red Hawk knew they couldn't remain in the cave any longer. Pike had maintained his siege position throughout the endless night, occasionally calling down taunts and threats. But the babies were becoming increasingly weak from hunger and cold. Samuel's cries had grown noticeably feeble, and Sarah barely responded when touched. Without proper nourishment and shelter, they would die within hours, regardless of Pike's intentions. We moved during the next lightning strike. Red Hawk told his warriors with quiet authority, "The thunder will cover our sounds, and the rain will wash away our tracks immediately." The wolf, despite her serious injury, had somehow sensed their intention to leave the temporary safety of the cave. She positioned herself near the entrance, her amber eyes fixed on the storm outside with intense concentration. The animal's breathing was labored and visible in the cool air, but her determination remained absolutely unshakable. When the next massive lightning bolt illuminated the entire forest like brilliant daylight, Red Hawk cradled the babies against his chest and sprinted from the cave into the storm. His wounded leg nearly buckled on the rain-slicked stones, but two hawks steadied him with strong hands before he could fall. Behind them, Standing Bear and Running Wolf provided covering fire as Pike's furious curses echoed through the thunder. The wolf limped determinedly after them. leaving a trail of bright blood that was immediately washed away by the driving rain. Red Hawk realized with growing despair that the noble animal was slowly dying, her wound having worsened significantly during the night. Yet she continued to follow them through sheer will, driven by protective instincts that transcended self-preservation. The terrain ahead was a nightmare of swollen streams and muddy slopes that shifted treacherously underfoot. What had been a gentle, meandering creek the day before was now a raging river, its waters brown and violent with runoff and debris. Ancient trees that had stood for decades were being systematically undermined by the flood, their massive roots exposed and their trunks groaning ominously in the wind. The only way across the torrent was a fallen log that had fortuitously wedged itself between two massive boulders, creating a natural bridge barely wide enough for single-file passage. The bark was slick with rain and treacherous algae, and the raging water below promised instant death to anyone unlucky enough to fall. "I'll go first and test it." Two Hawks volunteered, but Red Hawk shook his head firmly. "I carry the babies. If the log fails better, it fails with me than with all of us. You're needed to lead the others to safety." Red Hawk stepped carefully onto the makeshift bridge, feeling it sag alarmingly under his weight. The babies were crying weakly, their small bodies shivering despite his desperate efforts to keep them warm and dry. Below him, the flood roared with a sound like continuous thunder, and he could see debris, branches, rocks, even the bloated carcass of a deer rushing past with terrifying speed. Halfway across his foot slipped on a patch of wet bark made treacherous by the storm. For a terrifying moment, he teetered on the very edge of the log, his arms windmilling wildly as he fought to maintain balance. The baby's cries became piercing screams of terror, and Red Hawk felt his grip on them loosening as gravity pulled him toward the churning water below. Standing Bear lunged forward with desperate speed, his strong hand closing around Red Hawk's wrist just as the chief began to fall toward certain death. The sudden jerk nearly pulled both men into the flood, but Two Hawks grabbed Standing Bear's leather belt and hauled them back onto the log. For a heart-stopping moment, all three men swayed dangerously, the baby's screams mixing with the roar of the water below. The letter Red Hawk gasped, feeling frantically in his medicine pouch as they regained their precarious balance. Elizabeth Clayton's blood-stained message was gone, swept away by the river current during their near-fatal fall. The only written proof of Pike's systematic crimes had been destroyed by the very storm that was meant to protect them. They completed the crossing in grim silence, each man knowing that their chances of survival, and more importantly, of bringing Pike to justice, had just decreased dramatically. Without the letter, Pike's word would carry more weight than their testimony, especially if he claimed the babies were his own children, stolen by savage Indians. On the far side of the raging river, and they found temporary shelter beneath a massive, overhanging rock formation. The babies were dangerously cold, their lips turning blue despite Red Hawk's frantic efforts to warm them with his body heat. The wolf collapsed nearby, her breathing so shallow that Red Hawk wondered if she was already beginning to die. Their Rauberstarm, Running Wolf pointed through the driving rain. Pikes found another crossing point. The relentless bounty hunter had located a place where the flood had deposited enough debris to create a temporary dam. He was making his way across carefully but steadily, his rifle held high above his head to keep it dry. His knowledge of the terrain was proving decisive, just as he had boasted with such confidence. "We can't outrun him," Standing Bear said flatly. "Not carrying the babies and not with that wolf slowing us down." Red Hawk looked at the dying wolf, then at the babies in his arms. Samuel's eyes were closed, his breathing barely perceptible. Sarah was still crying, but her voice was growing weaker with each passing moment. They were dying in his arms, and all his courage and determination might not be enough to save them. "Then we make our final stand here," he said quietly. "If Pike wants them, he'll have to kill us all to get them." The wolf raised her head at the sound of his voice, making what might have been her last gesture of defiance. Her amber eyes met his with an intensity that spoke of shared understanding and purpose. The animal struggled to her feet, swaying with exhaustion and blood loss, but positioning herself between the babies and the direction of Pike's relentless approach. Thunder crashed overhead with deafening force, and lightning illuminated Pike's figure, moving steadily toward them through the storm. The man was perhaps 50 yards away now, close enough that Red Hawk could see the cold determination in his eyes, and the way his finger rested on the trigger. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Red Hawk knew with absolute certainty that not all of them would survive it. The babies' cries grew even weaker, and Red Hawk realized with growing horror that they might die from exposure before Pike even reached them. All their sacrifice, all their courage, all their determination to seek justice might be for nothing if the children perished in his arms before the battle could be fought. But the wolf's presence reminded him of something crucially important. Sometimes the greatest acts of protection required the ultimate sacrifice. The noble animal had already proven that truth with her actions, and Red Hawk was prepared to follow her example without hesitation. Pike emerged from the storm like a demon conjured from the very depths of hell itself. His leather coat soaked black with rain, and his eyes holding the wild, dangerous gleam of a man who had completely abandoned all pretense of civilization. Lightning illuminated his face in stark, terrifying relief, revealing features that had been twisted by years of systematic violence and insatiable greed. The rifle in his powerful hands was trained steadily on Red Hawk, and his finger rested on the trigger with the practiced ease of a natural killer. "End of the line, Chief." Pike called through the thunder, his voice carrying clearly despite the howling wind. "Been one hell of a chase, I'll give you that, but playtime's over now. You've caused me more trouble than you're worth." Red Hawk struggled to his feet. The babies clutched protectively against his chest. Samuel was barely breathing, his tiny body limp with cold and exhaustion. Sarah's cries had faded to weak whimpers that were almost drowned out by the storm's fury. They were dying in his arms, and he felt powerless to save them without first dealing with the man who had murdered their father and 6 other families. "You killed Thomas Clayton." Red Hawk said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "He was no threat to you or your ambitions." Pike's laugh was harsh and completely mirthless, echoing off the surrounding rocks like the sound of grinding bones. "Clayton was a fool who thought he could homestead on land I'd already claimed through right of conquest. I gave him a fair chance to walk away, but he chose to fight for what was never his. His mistake, and now it's yours." The wolf had positioned herself between Pike and the babies, her hackles raised despite her obvious weakness and injury. Bright blood continued to seep from her wounds, staining the muddy ground beneath her paws. She was clearly dying, but she absolutely refused to yield her protective position. "And Elizabeth Clayton." Red Hawk pressed, remembering the letter's devastating contents. "What of the woman who wrote about your crimes in her own blood?" Pike's grin was all yellowed teeth and no warmth whatsoever. "What woman never seen any woman around these parts, Chief? Just found some abandoned babies that some careless Indians lost track of. Tragic, really, but these things happen on the frontier." The lie was so brazen, so casually delivered, that Red Hawk felt his rage building like the storm around them. This was exactly how evil survived and prospered through systematic denial, misdirection, and the methodical murder of witnesses. Pike had clearly perfected the art of covering his tracks, and he intended to add Red Hawk and his warriors to his growing list of victims. Standing Bear, 2 Hawks, and Running Wolf had spread out in a defensive semicircle, their weapons ready, but clearly outmatched by Pike's superior position. The killer had the high ground, better cover, and the significant advantage of knowing exactly what he was fighting for. He would kill them all without hesitation before allowing any survivors to testify against him. "Or hand over the babies," Pike commanded, taking a deliberate step forward. Rain streamed from his tangled beard, and his cold eyes never left Red Hawk's face. "Do it right now, and I might let some of you live long enough to regret crossing me." Red Hawk's answer was to cradle the infants even closer to his chest, feeling their weak heartbeats against his ribs like tiny drums. "They are under the sacred protection of the Lakota people. I will not surrender them to their father's murderer." Pike's expression darkened with murderous rage, and Red Hawk saw the exact moment when negotiation ended and pure violence began. "Then you'll all die for absolutely nothing, and those babies will freeze to death in this storm anyway." The first shot came without any warning, Pike's rifle spitting flame and smoke through the driving rain. The bullet splintered stone inches from Red Hawk's head, sending razor-sharp fragments flying through the air. The babies screamed in terror, their cries mixing with the thunder in a cacophony of fear and pain that seemed to shake the very earth. Red Hawk dove behind a fallen log, protecting the infants with his body, as Pike's second shot blasted bark from the tree trunk. Splinters stung his face and hands, but he kept the babies covered as he desperately tried to locate his warriors' positions through the chaos. Standing Bear was already in motion, his bow drawn and a deadly arrow nocked. The battle exploded into complete chaos as lightning illuminated the battlefield in stark, strobing detail. Two hawks flanked left, using the storm's fury to mask his movement, while Running Wolf circled right with his tomahawk gleaming wetly in the rain. Pike's rifle cracked again, and the muzzle flash illuminating his snarling face as he tried to track multiple targets through the driving rain. The wolf lunged forward with what might have been her very last strength, her massive jaws snapping at Pike's legs. The bounty hunter cursed viciously and kicked at the animal, his heavy boot connecting with her wounded ribs and sending her sprawling across the muddy ground. But the wolf's desperate attack disrupted his aim long enough for Standing Bear to loose an arrow that whistled through the storm. The arrow found its mark, burying itself deep in Pike's left shoulder and spinning him around. He roared in pain and fury, his rifle swinging wildly as he tried to bring it to bear on the wolf. The animal's teeth found his boot, and Pike's immediate response was to draw his razor-sharp knife and plunge it into the wolf's neck. The blade sliced deep, and the wolf's howl of agony cut through the storm like a blade through silk. But even as she died, the noble animal's jaws clamped down on Pike's ankle, her final act, one of defiance and protection that would be remembered forever. Red Hawk watched the wolf collapse, her amber eyes already beginning to glaze over with approaching death. The animal that had protected the babies with such fierce devotion was dying, her life's blood flowing away into the mud. The sight ignited something primal and unstoppable in Red Hawk's chest, a fury that transcended rational thought or careful strategy. "More for the children," he screamed, charging toward Pike with the baby still clutched in his arms. Pike's wounded shoulder made his aim unsteady, but he was still deadly dangerous at close range. His rifle swung toward Red Hawk, and the barrel beginning to stabilize as his finger tightened on the trigger. The range was point blank, impossible to miss. Red Hawk saw his own death reflected in the weapon's black muzzle. The shot never came. Two hawks materialized from the storm like a vengeful spirit, his rifle butt connecting with Pike's skull in a sickening crack that echoed through the thunder. The bounty hunter staggered, bright blood streaming from his scalp, but he was far from finished. His hand closed around his knife, and he slashed at two hawks with desperate, animalistic fury. The blade caught two hawks across the ribs, opening a line of red through his buckskin shirt. The warrior gasped and fell backward, his rifle clattering away among the rocks. Pike pressed his advantage, raising the knife for a killing blow, but Running Wolf's tomahawk took him in the back, its blade biting deep between his shoulder blades. Pike screamed and spun around, the knife flashing toward Running Wolf's throat. The two men grappled in the mud, and their weapons locked between them, neither able to gain decisive advantage. Pike was stronger, but Running Wolf was faster and more desperate to protect the innocent. The storm reached its absolute crescendo as they fought, lightning striking a massive tree not 50 yards away and splitting it in half with a crack like the world ending. The thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet and rattle their bones. Red Hawk found himself caught between protecting the babies and helping his brother. The infants were still crying weakly, their small bodies shaking with cold that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. Every second of delay brought them closer to death from exposure regardless of the battle's outcome. The decision was made for him when Pike broke free from Running Wolf's grip and lunged toward Red Hawk with a knife extended. The bounty hunter's eyes were wild with pain and rage, and his blade was aimed directly at the helpless babies. Red Hawk twisted away desperately, feeling the knife slice through his shirt and across his ribs. The wound was shallow, but painful, and it unbalanced him just enough to send him sprawling in the treacherous mud. The babies' cries became piercing screams of terror as they were jarred by the fall. Pike stood over him, the knife raised for a final strike. Rain streamed from his face, mixing with blood from his multiple wounds, and his expression was that of a man who had crossed the line into complete madness. "Should have minded your own business, Chief. These babies are mine, and I'll kill anyone who tries to take them from me." Red Hawk saw the knife beginning to descend and knew he had perhaps 1 second to act. His hand closed around a stone the size of his fist, and with all his remaining strength, he drove it into Pike's temple. The impact was solid and final, and Pike's eyes rolled back as he collapsed face first into the mud. The bounty hunter's body twitched, once then went completely still. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers, and Red Hawk could see that Vernon Pike, systematic murderer, claim jumper, and child killer, was finally dead. The sudden silence was absolutely deafening. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of violence. Red Hawk struggled to his feet, the babies clutched protectively against his chest, and looked around at the carnage. Two Hawks was pressing a hand to his wounded ribs, but he was alive and alert. Running Wolf was checking Pike's body for signs of life, his tomahawk ready for another blow if needed. Standing Bear was retrieving his scattered arrows, his eyes constantly scanning the forest for additional threats. The wolf lay dying beside the fallen log, her amber eyes fixed on the babies in Red Hawk's arms. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, but she seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps assurance that her ultimate sacrifice had not been in vain. Red Hawk knelt beside the wolf, still holding the babies close to his chest. "You saved them," he whispered in Lakota. "You gave your life for children, not your own. The spirits will remember your courage and honor you forever." The wolf's tail moved slightly, perhaps a final gesture of acknowledgement and peace. Then her eyes closed, and her breathing stopped. The noble animal that had protected Samuel and Sarah Clayton with such fierce devotion was dead, her body already beginning to grow cold in the storm. Red Hawk felt tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. The wolf had shown him something profound about the nature of sacrifice and the bonds that could form between the most unlikely companions. In death, the animal had achieved something that few humans ever managed: perfect selfless love that transcended species and circumstance. The storm began to weaken as Red Hawk and his warriors carried the babies toward the distant smoke of their tribal camp. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the thunder had faded to distant rumbles, but the damage was already done. The infants were barely clinging to life, their small bodies racked with cold and exhaustion that threatened to claim them even in victory. Red Hawk's own wounds were taking their toll on his battered body. The gash across his ribs had stopped bleeding, but every breath sent spikes of pain through his chest. His wounded leg was severely swollen and throbbing, making each step a test of will and endurance. Two Hawks was in similar condition, one hand pressed to his wounded side, while the other helped support their leader. There. Running Wolf pointed through the trees with evident relief. "The camp. We're almost home." Red Hawk could see the familiar shapes of teepees through the morning mist, smoke rising from cooking fires that promised warmth and safety. But he also knew that their arrival would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. The tribal council would have to decide the fate of two white orphans, and not all of the elders would be sympathetic to their cause. As they approached the camp, Red Hawk's sister-in-law, Flowing Water, emerged from her teepee and ran toward them with urgent concern. She was a woman of middle age who had lost her own children to disease, and her maternal instincts were still strong. One look at the babies in Red Hawk's arms told her everything she needed to know about the emergency. What has happened?" she asked, immediately taking charge of the situation. "These children are nearly dead from cold and exposure." Red Hawk gratefully allowed her to take the infants, trusting her expertise completely. Flowing Water was skilled in healing and had helped deliver many babies in the tribe. If anyone could save Samuel and Sarah, it would be her. Prepare warm milk immediately. She ordered the other women who had gathered around. And soft furs. These babies need heat and nourishment right now, or they will not survive another hour. As the women worked frantically to save the children, Red Hawk faced the more difficult task of explaining their presence to the tribal council. Chief Gray Eagle, an elderly man with deep lines around his eyes and wisdom carved into his weathered features, listened gravely as Red Hawk recounted the events of the past 3 days. "You risked the lives of our warriors for white children," Gray Eagle said when the story was finished. "Children whose people have shown us nothing but hatred and systematic violence." "They are innocent," Red Hawk replied firmly. "Their father was murdered by the same kind of man who killed my family. They deserve protection, not abandonment, to die in the wilderness." The council members muttered among themselves, their faces showing the strain of a decision that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire tribe. Harboring white children could bring military retaliation, but abandoning them would violate the fundamental Lakota principle of protecting the helpless. "The army will come looking for them," warned Broken Lance, another respected elder. "When they do, they will not distinguish between guilty and innocent. They will see only Indians with white children and draw their own conclusions." Red Hawk understood their concerns with perfect clarity, but he also knew that some things were more important than mere safety. If we abandon these children, we become no better than the men who killed their parents. The spirits judge us by how we treat the defenseless. Old Woman Crow, the eldest member of the council, spoke for the first time. Her voice was like autumn wind through dry leaves, but her words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom. "The wolf died protecting them. Animals know truth better than men sometimes. If the wolf saw something worth dying for, perhaps we should listen to that lesson." The debate continued for hours, with arguments both passionate and practical. Some council members feared that keeping the babies would bring military retaliation that could destroy the entire tribe. Others argued that turning away innocent children would damn their souls in the eyes of the Great Spirit. Finally, Flowing Water emerged from her teepee with news that changed everything. "The babies will live," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the council circle. "But they are weak and will need constant care for many days to come." The sight of the two small faces, pale but breathing steadily, seemed to settle the matter. Samuel's blue eyes were open and alert, and Sarah's cries were strong and healthy. They were fighters, these children, and they had survived against impossible odds. Gray Eagle stood slowly, his aged joints creaking audibly. "The children stay," he declared with finality. "We will raise them as our own, and if the army comes, we will face that challenge when it arrives. But we will not abandon innocent life to preserve our own comfort." Red Hawk felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders. The immediate crisis was over, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. Samuel and Sarah Clayton would need more than just physical care. They would need a place to belong, a new identity that honored both their tragic origins and their adopted home. 3 days after the battle with Vernon Pike, Red Hawk was awakened by urgent shouts from the camp's outer perimeter. His wounds were healing well under Flowing Water's careful ministrations, and the babies, Samuel and Sarah, were growing stronger each day. The boys' blue eyes had regained their brightness, and the girls' cries were healthy and demanding. Riders approaching under a white flag, Standing Bear called from the entrance of Red Hawk's teepee. A woman and two men moving slowly and carefully. Red Hawk struggled to his feet, his wounded leg still stiff but manageable. Through the teepee's opening, he could see three figures on horseback approaching the camp. The lead rider was clearly a woman, her long hair streaming behind her despite the bandage around her head. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about her posture and the determined way she held herself. As they drew closer, Red Hawk felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman's face was pale and drawn with exhaustion, marked by recent injuries, but her eyes were the same striking blue as little Samuel's. This was Elizabeth Clayton, the baby's mother, somehow alive and desperately searching for her children. The tribal council gathered quickly as the riders entered the camp. Elizabeth Clayton slid from her horse with obvious difficulty, her movements betraying recent trauma and lingering pain. The two men with her were clearly settlers, but they kept their weapons holstered and their hands visible in unmistakable gestures of peace. "I'm looking for my children," Elizabeth said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Twin babies, a boy and a girl. They were taken from our homestead near Beaver Creek 3 days ago." Red Hawk stepped forward, gesturing for flowing water to bring the infants. "Your children are safe," he said in careful English. "We have protected them from the man who killed your husband." Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure crumbled completely when she saw Samuel and Sarah. She fell to her knees, gathering both babies into her arms as tears streamed down her face. "My babies," she whispered. "My precious babies. I thought I had lost you forever." The reunion was so powerful that even the most skeptical tribal members were moved to tears. Here was absolute proof that their decision to protect the children had been morally correct, proof that sometimes courage and compassion could triumph over fear and prejudice. "How did you survive?" Red Hawk asked gently. "We found your letter. We thought Pike had killed you." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and overwhelming gratitude. "I was wounded when Pike attacked our cabin, shot in the shoulder when I tried to stop him from taking the babies. I managed to hide in the root cellar until his men finished searching the house. When I came out, you were already gone with my children." One of the men with her, a bearded settler named Jim Morrison, stepped forward. "We've been tracking Pike's movements for weeks. He's been systematically claiming homesteads all along the territory border, killing the legal owners and forging new deeds. Elizabeth's testimony is exactly what we need to bring him to justice. Pike is dead," Two Hawks said bluntly. "He died trying to reclaim the children. We have witnesses to his crimes." Morrison's weathered face showed grim satisfaction. "Then justice has been served, though not through the courts. There are at least 6 other families who've lost loved ones to Pike's schemes. This news will bring them peace." Elizabeth struggled to her feet, still holding her babies close. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Red Hawk. "You risked everything to save my children when their own people had abandoned them. A wolf showed us the way." Red Hawk replied simply, "She died protecting them, just as any mother would. Your children were never truly abandoned. They were guarded by someone who understood the true meaning of love." Elizabeth's expression grew puzzled. So Red Hawk explained about the wolf's sacrifice, about how the animal had protected the babies, and ultimately given her life to save them. As he spoke, Elizabeth's eyes filled with new tears of understanding. "There was a wolf that used to come near our cabin," she said softly. "After Thomas died, I would see her watching from the tree line, especially when the babies were outside. I thought she was dangerous, but now I understand. She was protecting us even then." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with perfect clarity. The wolf had been watching the Clayton family, drawn by the sound of babies that reminded her of her own lost young. When Pike murdered Thomas and abandoned Elizabeth and the children, The wolf had stepped in to fulfill the protective role that human society had failed to provide. Morrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we should discuss what happens next. Your homestead is still legally yours, but it's not safe with Pike's men still scattered through the territory." Elizabeth looked at her babies, then at Red Hawk and the assembled tribal members. "I want to stay in the territory," she said with growing determination. "This is where my husband is buried, and these people saved my children's lives. I also want to help build bridges between our peoples if that's possible." Gray Eagle stepped forward, his aged face thoughtful. "The woman speaks wisdom. Our peoples have been enemies for too long. Perhaps it is time for a different path." What followed was an unprecedented negotiation between the Lakota Council and the small group of settlers. By evening, they had reached an agreement that would have seemed impossible just days before. Elizabeth would retain her homestead, but would also establish a trading post that would serve both communities. The settlers would provide early warning of military movements, while the Lakota would offer protection against outlaws and guidance through the dangerous terrain. "It's not a permanent solution," Morrison admitted honestly. "The Army and the territorial government won't be happy with this arrangement. But it's a start. Maybe other communities can learn from this example." As the negotiations concluded, Red Hawk found himself standing beside Elizabeth Clayton as she prepared to leave with her children. The babies were sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware that their ordeal had helped forge a new kind of relationship between their peoples. "The wolf," Elizabeth said quietly. "Will you show me where she died? I want to pay my respects to the creature who saved my children." Red Hawk nodded, and together they walked to the edge of the camp, where the animal's body had been buried with full honors. The grave was marked with stones arranged in a sacred circle, and someone had left wildflowers on the freshly turned earth. "She saved them when I couldn't," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "She was a better mother than I was in that moment of crisis. She was driven by love." Red Hawk replied with quiet wisdom. "The same love that brought you here to find them despite your wounds and the danger. That kind of love transcends all boundaries of species and tribe." Elizabeth knelt beside the grave, whispering words of gratitude that the wind carried away. When she stood, her expression was resolute and determined. "I want my children to know this story," she said firmly. "I want them to understand that their lives were saved by courage and sacrifice from sources they might never have expected. The wolf, your people, everyone who chose to protect rather than destroy." Red Hawk felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with healing wounds. They will grow up knowing both their heritage and their debt to others. That is the best kind of education a child can receive. As Elizabeth and her escort prepared to leave, she turned back to Red Hawk one final time. "Will you visit us? I want Samuel and Sarah to know the man who saved their lives, and I want to learn more about the people who showed such kindness to strangers." "I will come," Red Hawk promised. "And I will bring stories of the wolf who loved them enough to die for them." The small party rode away into the afternoon sunlight, carrying with them the hope of a new kind of relationship between peoples who had been enemies for too long. Red Hawk watched until they disappeared beyond the horizon, then turned back to his own people with a sense of completion he had not felt since his family's death. The story of the wolf and the babies would be told around Lakota fires for generations to come. It would serve as a reminder that courage and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear, and that sometimes the most unlikely guardians could provide the most perfect protection. In the days that followed, word of the agreement spread throughout the territory. Other settlers began to approach the Lakota with requests for similar arrangements, and gradually a network of mutual protection and cooperation began to develop. It wasn't perfect, there were still conflicts and misunderstandings, but it represented a genuine beginning. Years later, when Samuel and Sarah Clayton were old enough to understand, they would visit the wolf's grave and hear the full story of their rescue. They would learn that their lives had been saved not by armies or governments, but by individuals who chose to act with courage and compassion when it mattered most. The wolf's amber eyes would live on in their memories, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love come from the most unexpected sources. And in the growing friendship between their mother and the Lakota people, they would see proof that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome by shared recognition of what was truly worth protecting. Red Hawk never forgot the sight of the wolf's final breath or the way her eyes had held his own in those last moments. The animal had shown him that real strength wasn't measured in battle victories or conquered enemies, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for the innocent and helpless. In the end, the wolf had achieved something that no warrior or politician had managed. She had brought together two different worlds through the simple act of protecting what needed protection. That legacy would endure long after the last echoes of gunfire had faded from the Dakota territory, a testament to the power of love over hatred and courage over fear. The story was complete, but its impact would ripple through generations, carried forward by the children who had been saved, and the adults who had learned that sometimes the greatest enemies could become the most unexpected allies. In the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where survival often depended on the ability to see others as threats, the wolf had taught them all a different lesson, that the capacity for love and sacrifice knew no boundaries of species, race, or tradition. And in that truth, Red Hawk found the peace that had eluded him since his own family's death, knowing that some bonds transcend even death itself.